On this season of the show so far, we've seen 3 men claim to be the governor of Spanish Florida, and we've seen all 3 men die trying to make that a reality. So at this point, what kind of man would take up such a mantle? Well, with that, let's meet Hernando de Soto. At the young age of 14, de Soto came to New Spain having nothing but a name from minor nobility and a sword to his name. He steadily gained reputation as a fierce Indian fighter, participating in 20 years of brutal campaigns to pacify the natives of Central America. He became the first governor of Panama. During this time, he bound himself to 2 other conquistadors in a partnership, a common practice for the time, wherein the partners would share a set fraction of their wealth with one another. This type of arrangement would create a sense of financial security, and it was an investment in one another, and in many ways it functioned as a precursor to modern-day insurance policies. One of the 3 died young, and de Soto continued his partnership as a duo, along with a man by the name of Hernan Ponce de Leon, who may have been a nephew of the first so-called governor of Florida, Juan Ponce de Leon. The 2 men became extremely wealthy in the sordid business of capturing natives and selling them into slavery. Then de Soto served directly under Francisco Pizarro as a leader in the invasion and toppling of the Incan Empire. His share of the war spoils made de Soto one of the richest men in the Spanish Empire and perhaps the world. De Soto returns to Spain in 1536, buys a large estate, and marries into a prominent family. Within a year, he becomes a figure in the royal court, and he uses his newfound influence in 1537 to gain appointment to the governorship of Cuba and the Adelantado of Florida. An Adelantado would be responsible with financing much of the takeover of a specified region, but then would be rewarded with the rights to govern this region, which would become hereditary and also have special financial interests in the imports and exports of this new colony. Now at this point, the crown consolidated the old charters of De Leon and Narvaez for Florida to make de Soto's hypothetical Florida everything from modern-day Florida to at least Virginia, some say Newfoundland, all the way west to the borders of New Spain in the American Southwest. A very generous charter. But if you have not listened to other episodes of this season, it's worth noting that Spanish Florida contained 0 Spanish settlements, and yet hundreds of Spanish corpses. It was a paper empire. According to de Soto's charter, in order to secure his position as adelantado, he was to raise at least 500 colonists, provide supplies to sustain these people for 18 months, conquer 200 leagues of coastline of his choosing, and build 3 stone forts to protect 2 to 3 settlements. The king made it clear to de Soto that Spanish Florida should be a colony of well-defended coastal cities. This will become important later on. Furthermore, the king specified that de Soto was to provide for good treatment of the Native Americans, so that they may come to Catholicism willingly. Later, we will break down how well de Soto follows the king's plans. With charter in hand, de Soto invites Cabeza de Vaca, one of the 4 survivors of the Narvaez expedition, to his mansion for a meeting. It was no secret that de Vaca, after spending the better part of a decade wandering the North American continent, returned to Spain to secure his own charter to settle Florida, only to find de Soto secured these rights months before. De Vaca, before setting off to the New World, was a soldier and a court figure, himself from minor nobility, a trusted ally of the king who was sent with Narvaez to ensure the king received his designated percentages of any of the spoils. He returned a sun-baked shell of his former self, and now he was stepping into a life he could just as easily have had. Like de Soto, had he gone to Central America instead of Florida, who knows? And now de Vaca is sitting across from de Soto, some years younger than himself, and de Soto proposes that de Vaca returns to Florida as his subordinate. De Vaca politely declines, and the 2 men have a conversation about the land of Florida, where de Soto comes away with the same impression of de Vaca that many Spaniards had, wherein the man had so many horrific tales about the place, and yet sought to become its governor. People inferred that de Vaca may be hiding something. Perhaps there were cities of gold after all. De Vaca, as the head of a small group of 4 survivors, could have seen such things without having the strength to conquer. And now was being coy because he was biding his time so that he could return in force. These were the thoughts that rattled around the heads of the Spanish in 1537, hot off the heels of the conquest of the Incan Empire. De Vaca agreed to help De Soto recruit colonists, and the two men went their separate ways. De Soto tapped into his extended network of interconnected families of nobility for funding and officers, and then recruited a number of fellow conquistadors for whom he served with in Peru, to fill out the finances and leadership of this new venture, which could very easily be compared to the process of making a startup company today. Except, instead of recruiting a Warren Buffett-like investor, he brought on board men like Vasco Figueroa, a conquistador who was well known to have castrated a number of his male slaves, and then made them eat their own genitals. The same man, having lost his own brother in a past expedition to Florida, probably wouldn't have very fuzzy feelings for the natives there either. The general recruitment efforts went extremely well. With De Soto's resources, De Vaca's help, the legendary tale of Ponce de Leon warping into a story about a fountain that would cure impotence or regain your youth. And then there was the rumor in the far west of a golden collection of cities known as the 7 cities of Cibola, somewhere north of Mexico. It was easy to find people who wanted to sign up. De Soto recruits so many colonists he has to leave people behind because he could not physically fit them in his boat safely. With all this enthusiasm, the historian Hugh Thomas writes that
De Soto was convinced that the expedition was going to make him the richest man in the world.
But despite the optimism, when he leaves Spain for Cuba in April of 1538, he is in debt, having risked his massive fortune and that of many of his relatives on the promise of Florida. His only remaining safety net, of course, is now the governorship of Cuba, a fact many forget in retelling the story of De Soto. Shortly after arriving in Cuba, he discovers none other than his financial partner, Hernando Ponce de Leon, stowing away gold on ships to avoid having to give De Soto his share. De Soto, now suddenly governor of the island, uses his power to take half of it, chastises De Leon for his deceit. The gold would give De Soto the resources he needed to govern Cuba for an entire year, which he had to do and delay his expedition because he needed to put down a slave rebellion on the island. These were brutal, brutal times. During this time, he has to sustain all of the colonists he brought with him, and he was only able to responsibly depart when everything was settled again on the island. In the meantime, he sends Juan de Anasco to survey the coast and capture natives along the way to train as interpreters, a common and sad practice. 4 of these natives filled the heads of the Spanish with tales of gold, which they offered to lead the Spanish to if they could only be returned to the continent. De Soto, a year out from leaving Spain, with memories of the golden Incan Empire in his mind and rumors of golden cities to the north, appoints his own wife, Isabel, to be lieutenant governor of the island, acting governor in his stead. He makes out a will and leaves for Florida in May of 1539. In total, he brought along 9 ships with somewhere between 600 soldiers, 12 priests, 2 women, perhaps 200 servants and slaves, 220 horses, livestock, and attack dogs. Of all of the people for which we know their age, De Soto was the eldest, being only about 38 years old. That's my age right now, by the way. Now, from this point on, we have 3 sources about what happens next. First, a summary of a report by De Soto's secretary, which was then only preserved in a secondary source written by the historian Oviedo. This is the more detailed account. The next source we have comes from Hernandez de Baidma, who went along with De Soto and only wrote down his account after the fact in 1544. The third is a document written by the Gentleman of Elvas, a Portuguese man who went with De Soto. The account dates to 1557. Now, the last 2 documents have so many similarities, scholars postulate that the gentleman may have used Baidma's account as the basis for his own, adding his own details or amending what he perceived to be an error. Who knows? It's debatable, but it's important that we talk about these things. I like to go through the sources for any given episodes just to illustrate how the information came to us today and how that information hinges on so few people actually putting feather to paper. It also helps us better evaluate the information in regards for accuracy, omissions, and bias. On May 30th, 1539, De Soto makes landfall at what most historians agree was Tampa Bay, which was in the same general area for both Narvaez and Ponce de Leon. If you listen to those episodes, you'll notice a pattern of De Soto making the same mistakes as his predecessors. It's infuriating. Here, the Spanish are attacked immediately by the Osita people, who at this point knew what an invasion looked like when it showed up on the horizon. But De Soto easily subdued their warriors and occupied their small village of just 7 to 8 houses, and he used it as his home base. The Osita were small in number and materially poor. The only things they had that the Spanish found interesting were small pearls. De Soto had the men clear away the trees from around the village within the shot of a crossbow and set up rotating shifts of guards. De Soto took the chief's house, and the rest of the buildings were occupied or the materials repurposed. He spends about 6 weeks here. As you can imagine, many of the colonists must have continued to use the ships for lodging, as an 800-plus population could not reside in such a small village of 7 to 8 houses. During this time, the Osita mentioned that the nearby Okala had all of the gold, silver, and pearls that could be found in the region, a common ploy used all over North America to send colonizers far away from yourself, and De Soto didn't even need the bait, as he never intended to follow his charter to a T anyway, as we're going to learn. De Soto tasked a fellow conquistador, Baltazar de Gallegos, a cousin of de Vaca, with taking 40 horsemen and 80 foot soldiers to find a village inland in one direction, and then he sent Juan Labilo to do the same in another direction. Labilo invaded a village and stole women, to which the natives rightly came to their defense, wounding 5 and killing 1 Spaniard. Labilo made a hasty retreat, managing to retain a number of the women. Gallegos, however, and his group were led in circles by their native guide until confronted by a group of natives, who briefly clashed until one of the natives ran to the forefront and said,
"Sirs, for the love of God and Saint Mary, do not kill me. I am a Christian, like you. I am a native of Seville, and my name is Juan Ortiz."
The Spanish heard these words come out of a man wearing native clothing, with native-styled hair, his skin darkened by the sun and covered head to toe in tattoos, and yet those words were enough to end the battle. As you can imagine, Gallegos and his company were curious as to how Juan Ortiz found himself in a Native American war party facing a Spanish army. Ortiz was one of the men on the boats during the Narvaez expedition. Narvaez sent his boats to rendezvous with his colonists marching north, but the two parties never met again. His boats eventually returned to Cuba, where Narvaez's wife then sent a number of boats back out again to search for her lost husband. Juan Ortiz went on one of these boats. He and a companion were sent out around the area of Tampa Bay, Narvaez's last known location, to make contact with the natives. The Osita find the 2 men, kill his companion, and take Ortiz captive. The Osita chief sought revenge against the Spanish after Narvaez had the dogs eat the chief's wife, a horrific detail not within de Vaca's account. Ortiz would now be the chief's slave, with a death sentence hanging over his head, which could be enacted at any moment. Ortiz told Gallegos that the men of the Osita would shoot arrows at him throughout the day, never letting him rest. And eventually, the chief took Ortiz and had him grilled over a bed of coals. His bellowing stirred the hearts of the chief's daughter, and she begged for his life to be spared. The Osita chief relented. Some scholars believe John Smith borrowed the outline of this story for his own story of being rescued by Pocahontas. Ortiz is then taken off the coals. The chief's daughters took him to mend him up. At one point, his wounds became so infected there were maggots living on his body. After he healed, he was made to guard the chief's ancestral temple, which contained the bodies of his dead relatives. Failure to guard the temple from scavenging animals would renew his death sentence. And after a close call, one of the chief's daughters gave him directions to flee to her father's enemies, the Mocazo. And this is where he had lived for the last 9 years before meeting the Spanish army. Ortiz now convinced the Spanish and the Mocazo that their initial clash was the result of a misunderstanding, and that the two peoples could quickly reach a peace. Ortiz and the chief of the Mocazo returned with Gallegos to De Soto's camp at Tampa Bay, which again was actually just the occupied village of the Ozita. Enemies to both parties, so that worked out. When the chief failed to return to the Mocazo, his own elderly mother traveled to Tampa Bay to present herself to De Soto to be sacrificed in exchange for the life of her son. To her relief, her son, Juan Ortiz, Gallegos, De Soto, they were all getting along quite well and enjoying themselves. Through Ortiz, the chief told De Soto that there was no gold in the area, but all the natives here paid tribute to a paramount chief at a place called Apalachee, who lived inland from Tampa Bay. He would have greater knowledge of this part of the world, and perhaps know the location of all the riches. Upon hearing this, De Soto sent Gallegos back out with 80 horsemen and 100 foot soldiers in the direction of Apalachee, somewhere near modern-day Nobleton, Florida, with Juan Ortiz, who would now serve as De Soto's translator. He was given a horse and Spanish clothes for the first time in about a decade. When they reached the outskirts of Apalachee, they were met by 30 native warriors who demanded to know the intentions of the Spanish. Getting right to the point, Gallegos had Ortiz ask them where the Spanish could find a land of riches, to which the braves told them the village of Okala, where they had domesticated deer and turkeys, gold, silver, and pearls. Gallegos, sensing deceit, took the men captive and sent word back to De Soto, who after 6 weeks of occupying the village of Ozita, decided to move his restless people inland. Now Gallegos was instructed to send 2 letters to De Soto, one telling the truth of the situation at Apalachee, and another exaggerating the prospect of riches, in case De Soto needed to sweeten the news to his people to remove themselves from the coast and leave the ships, their only lifeline, to the outside world. And it appears De Soto read the latter, because all of his men were suddenly pleading De Soto to go inland, despite the fact that the last group of Spaniards to do so in the very same area went in 300 strong and came out 8 years later in Mexico, only 4 in number. De Soto left behind Captain Pedro Calderon, along with 40 horsemen and 60 soldiers with 2 years of rations, in order to maintain a lifeline to the coast. The men who were to stay behind were crestfallen. De Soto also undertook the curious decision to send his boats away to Cuba for resupply. Many suspect he did this to keep the men under Calderon from deserting, a mild version of what Cortez did in Mexico when he simply burned his own ships. In a sign of things to come, De Soto sent native captives out as forward messengers. These captives, unsurprisingly, never returned. De Soto interrogated a native woman he still kept in his custody, and she admitted that she advised at least one of these captives to leave and never return. De Soto, enraged, threw the woman to his dogs, who tore her body into pieces and ate her remains. De Soto decided that his people would overwinter at Okala, to which the Apalachee captives would direct him. On July 20th, 1539, De Soto and Gallegos reunite their forces at the village of Luca, which paid tribute to the Apalachee. The chief of the Apalachee himself remained hidden in the swamps, neither speaking to the Spanish nor fighting them. He most certainly felt relief as the Spanish filtered out of his domain towards Okala. On the 26th, the men entered a labyrinth of swamps, slowing their progress to a muddy trudge. Then the Okala appeared and attacked. Then they ran off again, out of sight, again and again. The natives resorted to these guerrilla tactics in an attempt to wear down the resolve of the invading force. Eventually, the Spanish capture a few of these warriors, and forced them to lead them through the swamps. The warriors, however, would only lead the Spanish into a new ambush. The men, proving of no use to De Soto, were thrown to the dogs. As clever as the Okala were, the Spanish emerged from the swamps just outside of their paramount village. The scale of De Soto's army, their appearance and strange weapons, their beasts, caused the people to flee the settlement. De Soto sent out messengers to request a meeting with their chief, a man who would have remembered Narvaez and his Spaniards who came through the Okala region only a dozen or so years prior. And this chief wanted nothing to do with their kind. And after a long while with no reply, the chief finally sent a representative to say the following words.
I already know very well what your customs and behavior are like. To me, you are professional vagabonds who wander place to place, gaining your livelihood by robbing, sacking, and murdering people who have given you no offense. I want no manner of friendship or peace with people such as you, but instead prefer mortal and perpetual animosity.
To this, De Soto had the men steal all the food of the land, all while fighting off attacks from the Okala. When the natives managed to capture a Spaniard, they would cut off his head and send it back to De Soto. When the Spanish managed to capture a few of the Okala, they told De Soto through Juan Ortiz of a land to the north, with food and many villages that could support his army, along with mineral riches. Are you sensing a pattern here? De Soto again takes the bait, and he decides to divide his forces further, so he still has his men at Ozita. He would then take 50 horsemen and 100 foot soldiers to Apalachee, and the remainder would stay at Okala, under one of his leaders named Luis de Moscoso. All of his men would be supported by the food they managed to plunder, which amounted to about a 3-month supply. De Soto then heads north, invading 6 villages on his way to Apalachee. Throughout much of September, he finds that villages are abandoned upon his approach. His army is ambushed when the natives found it prudent. In return, he would steal the food that he found along the way and any people. This would only validate the natives' fear and animosity towards the Spanish. And De Soto would use their attacks to justify the enslavement of those he captured. The going proved to be so difficult, he sent for Moscoso and the men, who finally leave Ozita and meet up with the main force headed towards Apalachee. On September 15th, the Spanish arrive at a village named Napatuca, where the natives prove to be extremely hospitable, and they take the men in. De Soto is even invited to sleep in the chief's house, a high honor. While here, 7 chiefs arrive to offer De Soto an alliance against the Apalachee for the return of one of the chiefs De Soto had captured several days before. The deliberations were done through Juan Ortiz, who in return needed translators who knew both the native language he knew and the new language of this area. They had already traveled outside of their language domain. This seemed like a good idea for the Spanish until after the meeting, when the interpreters admit to Ortiz that this entire arrangement was a trap, and the Napatuca were also in on the ruse. What was going to happen is at their next arranged meeting, De Soto was going to be murdered by the natives. The Spanish pressed these interpreters as to why they were admitting the plot. As it turns out, these people felt that the plot was so thin and doomed to fail, they had no intention of suffering the inevitable consequences with their compatriots. De Soto, very bravely, despite what you or I might think of the man, this was a brave move, decided to go along with the plot, and he arrived at the designated meeting place with the captured chief, where the 2 men, as planned, walked to the middle of a large field together without entourage, with the Spanish on one end and 400 native warriors on the other end. So confident was De Soto of his own men that he then sat down. And as planned, the native warriors came swarming in from the sides of the field to assassinate De Soto. But Moscoso without receiving De Soto's sign, swept in with his cavalry and created a wall of men and horses around De Soto, lancing those who dared fight. Then the infantry moved in, and the two sides engaged in a fierce battle. De Soto's own horse died from a number of arrows. 30 or 40 native warriors were killed on the field, which sent many of the natives running into a nearby lake, where they tried to swim across safely. But the Spanish cavalry were able to encircle the lake and enclose them before the warriors could make it to the other side. Here, we can see how De Soto and Moscoso quite effectively used the novelty of their horses to the Native Americans to their advantage. But imagine this now. Hundreds of natives are trapped in a large lake, not standing in knee-deep water, but treading water in the safety of the center, where the lake bottom is far below where their feet can reach without going under. It was only a matter of time, and De Soto knew it. All he had to do was wait. Can you imagine the feeling of swimming in a lake, knowing inevitably you would either drown or have to surrender yourself over to these strange men who had every reason to kill you? Juan Ortiz, working with the interpreters, encouraged the men to surrender. And after about 14 hours of constant swimming, late into the night, the braves began to come ashore. In total, 300 surrender. They are placed in chains for the time being, until the next day, when De Soto unshackles the captured chiefs among them and asks them once again to make an alliance with the Spanish. A generous offer at this point, if we're being honest and fair. One chief knocks De Soto out cold and quickly begins strangling his unconscious body, letting out a war cry that inspires all of the captives to rise up and attack the Spanish, even with their own chains. The chief at the epicenter of the action is quickly killed, and De Soto recovered alive. The fighting continues for about half an hour. The Spanish killed everyone except the children, and a few of the natives who surrendered. These unfortunate souls were forced to kill the captured and wounded so that any of their people watching from the trees would see them as traitors and abandon any future effort to recover them. De Soto loses 2 teeth and will spend the next week or so unable to chew his own food. I wonder at this point if he remembered the fate of the other supposed governors of Spanish Florida. Ponce de Leon, shot with a native arrow, died later of infection, slowly, painfully. De Ayllon died of a disease, perhaps dysentery, pooping himself to death. And Narvaez was swept away on a makeshift barge, never to be seen again. Of course, this all pales in comparison to the state that De Soto leaves many of the places and people that he invades along the way. Let's focus on this for a quick minute. Leaving this area for Apalachee, several hundred natives are dead. Everyone else has been scattered. There's now a forced famine because De Soto has carried away all the food, and then unintentionally, old world diseases are left behind to wreak havoc on any survivors that could be found. From here, De Soto reaches a river, likely the Suwannee River, and on the other side, there is a native army looking back at them, taunting them, being quite confident they'd never be able to cross that river. One of De Soto's attack dogs, a dog named Bruto, took the bait and jumped into the river to start swimming towards the natives, and was killed by a hail of arrow from the natives themselves. At the death of his dog, De Soto then vowed to cross the river and seek vengeance. He quickly built a bridge and crossed the river on the 15th of September, 1539, stunning the natives on how fast they were able to accomplish this. The natives fled into the woods. Now moving into late September, over about a 4-day period, De Soto enslaves about 100 people of the Usachile nation, who were originally friendly with the Spanish. And upon their approach of the main village of Apalachee, a village known as Enhayaca, the Spanish again faced a number of ambushes in the woods. They even went as far as to make small traps to try to entangle the horses, likely using their knowledge of hunting deer to do so. It's safe to say that De Soto and company were not expecting a warm greeting when they reached the paramount village of the Apalachee. On October 6th, the Spanish reached Vaca in modern-day Tallahassee, where today a state park marks the archaeological site that has been positively associated with De Soto based on the artifacts there. The Spanish find the village abandoned and the people living in the swamps. Those poor souls must have been crestfallen when they realized that the Spanish intended to overwinter in their village. De Soto settled in for the season and sent his raiders off through Apalachee to steal the corn from the natives in the country. The Apalachee may have numbered 30,000 in population, and De Soto extracted enough maize for the Spanish to last square through the spring. However, many of the natives that they had enslaved since landing in Florida died over winter because they were underfed and underdressed. As for the Apalachee, the Spanish were an existential threat, and on November 29th, they set their own village of Vaca on fire, destroying 2/3 of the Spanish camp, followed by incessant rounds of guerrilla attacks. De Soto, in return, had any captured Apalachee burned alive or had their hands and noses cut off. Finally, the Spanish managed to capture the chief of the Apalachee, hoping this would end the attacks. When even this failed to pacify the Apalachee, the chief told De Soto, through the interpreters, that they would only back down if the warriors were ordered to do so by the chief himself. And so De Soto had the chief taken to the woods with a detachment of soldiers, where he immediately ran away, never to be seen again by the Spaniards. Although the Spanish accounts all note the natural bounty of the land of Apalachee, they found the people too headstrong to be subdued. While Apalachee would serve as a winter camp, it was clear to De Soto that this was neither the place to build a colony, nor was it naturally an Incan Empire worthy of his time to plunder. As such, De Soto had Juan Ortiz and the chain of translators he maintained question the captives as to the geography of this mysterious part of North America that we know so well today. One captive, named Perico, a young boy, claimed to not even be from Apalachee, but from a place on the East Coast, where his people lived. His people were called the Yupaha, and they pay tribute to the Cofetachequi, and I know I'm saying that wrong, who had a female chief. Perico claimed that her chiefdom had an abundance of pearls and gold. Now, by this point, De Soto had already heard tales like this before, but Perico accurately described how gold could be mined, refined, and worked into jewelry. Furthermore, the location, as could best be discerned, seemed aligned up with the legendary land of Zipira, as detailed by Francisco de Chicora. You can find that tale in the 3rd episode of this season. This was the best lead towards riches De Soto had received since landing in Florida, and perhaps in all of his time remaining in Florida. We'll see. De Soto decided that come the spring, his men would travel to Cofetachequi. Going all in, he sent word to his men at Tampa Bay to abandon base camp and their connection to the last known location of De Soto's people by anyone leaving in the boats. Glory seemed on the horizon, and yet as a stark reminder of what a supposed Spanish Florida can actually do to the Spaniards, one of De Soto's exploratory groups, going around in the wintertime in the vicinity of Apalachee and the periphery, they find the Bay of Horses, as the Spanish called it. This was named by the Narvaez expedition from our last episode. De Soto's men find the remains of a forge used to make nails for the rafts. Intending to float to Mexico, they find horse bones. Narvaez and company resorted to eating up all of their horses just to survive, hence the name Bay of Horses. And if the men knew the history of the Spanish in Florida, between Ponce de Leon, Lucas de Ayan, and Narvaez, it was far more likely that De Soto's colonists, after breaking contact with the shore, would sooner or later be desperately fleeing Florida rather than be sitting on a pile of gold. But even the slight chance of the latter would be worth the risk of the former. Believe it or not, we've only covered De Soto's tale through the winter of 1539-1540. In our next episode, we will see the Spanish enter the lands of the mound-building chiefdoms, which, among other events, will see De Soto fight the bloodiest battle on what would become American soil until the U.S. Civil War. If you enjoyed this podcast, please give me a 5-star review on whatever platform you wish. This has been another episode of the Other States of America History Podcast. I'm Eric Giannis. Thank you for listening.